Ideas have shaped our world in ways we rarely pause to consider. From widely embraced doctrines to bizarre sects lurking in obscurity, today, we dive into the chilling depths of the ideology iceberg, where familiar currents drift at the surface but the most unsettling beliefs lie hidden far below. As we descend through each frozen layer, we expose haunting stories that challenge everything you thought you knew. Tier 1. Conservatism. It had emerged when the French Revolution shook Europe to its core in the late 1700s. Edmund Burke, an Irish-born British statesman, watched the chaos unfold and penned his famous Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790. Burke argued that society worked best when it preserved its traditions, institutions, and gradual change rather than sudden revolutionary upheaval. In 1790, Burke had published his masterwork that would define conservative thought for centuries. He had argued that human nature was flawed and that societies needed established customs, religious faith, and inherited wisdom to function properly. Critics dismissed his ideas as backwards-looking defense of aristocracy, while supporters praised his insight into the dangers of radical change and mob rule. Thinkers like Joseph de Maistre and Louis de Bonnel in France expanded Burke's framework into a comprehensive worldview. German philosopher Friedrich von Savigny transformed legal theory by emphasizing historical precedent over abstract rights. American statesmen like John Adams propelled these ideas across the Atlantic, creating what became known as a living constitution that grew like an ancient oak tree, rooted in experience rather than theory. Intellectuals felt the vertigo of choosing between revolutionary promises and conservative warnings. University professors had grappled with questions about whether human reason could truly redesign society from scratch, while political circles experienced intense excitement over these fundamental questions about power and change. Conservative philosophy spread throughout the English-speaking world and continental Europe. American founding fathers like Alexander Hamilton adopted its skepticism of pure democracy, while Victorian Britain embraced its emphasis on gradual reform. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck later used conservative principles to create modern social programs. Today, conservatism continues to influence political parties worldwide and remains a major force in debates about the proper role of government, tradition, and social change. Would you consider yourself more conservative, or do you find yourself leaning toward new perspectives? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and share the video. Next, we're exploring how the power of ideas, especially the belief that reality is shaped by the mind, became one of the most influential forces in modern thought. Idealism. Idealism emerged from an ancient philosophical debate: is reality fundamentally physical matter or mental and spiritual? Plato believed perfect eternal ideals existed behind all physical things, and true knowledge came from understanding these pure essences rather than just observing the physical world. Later, philosopher George Berkeley rejected materialism entirely, arguing that only minds and thoughts truly exist. What we call matter is just our perceptions and ideas in consciousness. This philosophical debate clashed with the growing scientific method, which relied on observation and experiments. Then, in 1781, Immanuel Kant published his famous work, Critique of Pure Reason, with a groundbreaking idea. Our minds don't just passively absorb reality, they actively shape what we experience through built-in ways of thinking. Kant's theory caused a huge stir. Critics said he was attacking objective science, while supporters praised him for giving humans free will and meaning in a world that science made seem purely mechanical. From this intellectual ferment emerged German idealism, led by Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, who transformed Kant's ideas into a cosmic version where spirit and nature were unified. They portrayed thought as a dynamic process where contradictions propelled development toward higher unity, writing epic narratives of minds unfolding rather than conventional philosophical treatises. In the days immediately following Kant's work, students and scholars alike had reported both exhilaration and intellectual vertigo as they wrestled with the notion that reality might itself be a mental construction. Those intense discussions had lasted months, with writers and lecturers revising their positions in real time. Idealism's influence spread far beyond Germany over the following decades. Romantic poets loved its emphasis on imagination, political thinkers used it to argue for human dignity, and later, philosophers either built on or rejected its main idea that mind is the foundation of all reality. This influence continues today in studies of reality, beauty, and ethics, suggesting that consciousness might be more fundamental than physical objects in shaping what we experience as real. Would you call yourself an idealist? Why or why not? Let me know in the comments below. Next up is a pretty common ideology if you do love your country: nationalism. Nationalism emerged when communities first began to question who truly belonged within their borders. Johann Gottfried Herder, a German philosopher, had planted the earliest seeds in the 18th century with his revolutionary idea that each people possessed a unique spirit tied to their language, culture, and homeland. In 1789, the French Revolution had transformed these abstract concepts into political reality. Philosophers and revolutionaries had argued that sovereignty belonged not to kings, but to the nation itself. Critics warned that this new thinking would tear apart the established order and create chaos, while supporters celebrated it as the birth of a true democracy and self-determination. The movement gained momentum as thinkers like Giuseppe Mazzini and Johann Fichte expanded Herder's vision. They transformed nationalism from a cultural idea into a political force that propelled the unification of Germany and Italy. Their collective dream became a powerful wave that swept across Europe, promising that every nation deserved its own state, like pieces finding their rightful place in a grand puzzle. Intellectuals had felt the intoxicating rush of imagining their people as chosen and special. Students had experienced the vertigo of realizing that their loyalty belonged not to distant monarchs, but to their own folk and soil. The ideologies spread rapidly across continents, inspiring independence movements from Latin America to Eastern Europe. Polish revolutionaries adopted these ideas to fight for their homeland's freedom. Greek rebels used nationalist fervor to break free from Ottoman rule. Irish leaders embraced it to challenge British dominance. Today, nationalism continues to shape global politics, from Brexit to independence movements worldwide, proving that the dream of national self-determination remains as powerful as ever. Next, we're diving into Maoism and its radical promise to remake humanity through collective revolution. Tier 2. Maoism. Maoism was a revolutionary doctrine that had emerged in the early 20th century as a distinctive adaptation of Marxism-Leninism to China's largely agrarian conditions. It had been composed by Mao Zedong and his associates in the Chinese Communist Party from the 1920s until Mao's death in 1976, and it had been built on the belief that China's vast peasant population, not its small urban proletariat, would supply the energy for a socialist revolution. China had been weak and divided after the fall of the Qing dynasty, and Mao had shaped his ideas against a backdrop of national crisis and anti-imperialist sentiment that had followed the May 4th movement of 1919. As rivalries deepened in the party and with the Kuomintang, Mao had refined this strategy through setbacks like the Autumn Harvest Uprising of 1927 and successes such as the establishment of the Jiangxi Soviet in 1931. These experiences had built suspense within the communist movement, as Mao's emphasis on guerrilla warfare by peasant forces had clashed with orthodox Marxist-Leninist skepticism about rural revolution. The tensions had culminated in the Long March of 1934 to 35 when Mao had consolidated his leadership amid extreme hardship and betrayal, setting the stage for his ascent within the party. At the core of Maoism's narrative lay two dramatic campaigns: the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962, and the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976. The Great Leap had aimed to collectivize agriculture and spur backyard steel production, but it had mismanaged resources and had collided with natural calamities, causing a famine that had killed 15 to 30 million people. The Cultural Revolution had followed, unleashing mass mobilization of youth against perceived bourgeois elements within the party and society, and it had churned fear, violence, and profound social upheaval. In the immediate aftermath, the country had faced emotional trauma and a devastated economy, prompting a gradual turn toward managerial expertise and professional governance after Mao's death. Over the long term, Maoism had left a complex legacy. Within China, it had given way to reform and opening up, yet around the world, insurgent movements in Nepal, India, and the Philippines had continued to invoke Maoist ideas as a blueprint for peasant-led revolution. If you're learning something new so far, like and share the video. Up next, we'll explore another movement born from historical trauma that reshaped an entire region through the pursuit of a promised homeland: Zionism. In the late 19th century, as Jewish communities across Europe faced increasing persecution, a revolutionary idea emerged from Theodor Herzl, an Austrian-Hungarian journalist. Zionism became defined as a Jewish nationalist movement that originated in Europe in the 19th century with the goal of the creation and support of a Jewish national state in Palestine. The movement rested on a radical premise: Jews needed their own homeland to escape persecution. Tension reached the boiling point as Herzl watched European society turn increasingly hostile toward Jewish populations. In 1896, He wrote Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, a manifesto that would ignite debates across continents. Herzl asserted that the only solution to the Jewish question in Europe, including growing anti-Semitism, was the establishment of a state for the Jews. The following year, he founded the Zionist Organization. The movement faced fierce opposition from religious Jews who believed only the Messiah could restore them to their homeland, socialist Bundists who saw it as a class destruction, and liberals who preferred assimilation. The pivotal moment arrived during World War I when British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued his famous declaration on November 2, 1917. The Balfour Declaration expressed British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for Jewish people. This single document transformed Zionism from a fringe movement into an internationally recognized political reality, representing the first major governmental endorsement of Zionist aspirations. The immediate aftermath saw an explosion of hope within Jewish communities worldwide, but also sparked fierce resistance from Arab populations in Palestine who suddenly found their homeland promised to another people. Jewish immigration to Palestine accelerated, settlements expanded, and the dream of a Jewish state seemed within reach for the first time in 2 millennia. The long-term repercussions fundamentally altered Middle Eastern geopolitics. The movement eventually led to Israel's establishment in 1948, but came with devastating costs, Palestinian displacement, and ongoing conflict that continues today. What are your thoughts on the Zionist movement? Up next, we'll explore another radical 19th century philosophy that sought to abolish all government and hierarchy. Anarchism. The mid-1800s were full of angry workers across Europe who hated how factory owners treated them. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a French thinker, was the first to call himself an anarchist and said, "Property is theft." Mikhail Bakunin, a hot-headed Russian, turned these ideas into action. By the 1860s, both had joined Karl Marx's worker group called the International, setting up a big fight. The Paris Commune of 1871 made everything explode. Though anarchists and Marxists worked together in this first big try at worker power, they disagreed underneath. Marx wanted to use government power to build socialism, while Bakunin wanted to destroy all government completely. Bakunin warned that Marx's way would just create new bosses. The big fight finally happened at the Hague meeting in September 1872. After a crazy session, they kicked Bakunin out by vote, and from then on, the red and black sides of the worker movement went different ways. Marx had schemed to control the International, while Bakunin stuck to anarchist ideas of letting groups run themselves. The personal hate between these two giants had hit the breaking point, with Marx saying Bakunin was running a secret group inside the International. What happened next hurt both movements badly. The International broke up in 1872, splitting into Marxist and anarchist groups, and neither lasted long. Bakunin started his own rival group called the Anti-Authoritarian International, but it didn't have enough money or unity. The split fractured the rebels just as capitalism was gaining momentum across Europe. This fight's effects lasted decades. The Marx-Bakunin split affected everything from the Russian Revolution to the Spanish Civil War, with anarchists and Marxists fighting each other as much as capitalists. It created two paths for change, taking over government power versus destroying it completely, an argument that continues today. The next one will make you imagine a society where personal freedom and shared ownership could work together perfectly. Tier 3. Anarcho-communism. After the 1872 split between anarchists and Marxists, the anarchist movement was in pieces. Bakunin's followers were shattered, and their ideas about getting rid of government seemed too vague for workers. Into this mess stepped Peter Kropotkin, a Russian prince who had given up his wealth to fight for the people. By the late 1870s, he was working with Carlo Cafiero and Élisée Reclus to create something new: anarcho-communism. Tension was building in anarchist circles throughout the 1880s. Kropotkin saw that Bakunin's ideas weren't enough. Workers wanted to know what would replace capitalism, not just hear about destroying it. While other anarchists talked about worker cooperatives, Kropotkin had a bigger vision. He believed people were naturally cooperative and that society could work without money, bosses, or government. His scientific background convinced him that cooperation, not competition, drove human evolution. The breakthrough came in 1892 when Kropotkin published The Conquest of Bread. This wasn't just another angry rant. It was a detailed blueprint for a new world. He painted a picture with communities where people worked together freely, shared everything they made, and took only what they needed. No wages, no prices, no government. Just human cooperation on a massive scale. The response was electric. The book spread like wildfire through anarchist networks across Europe and America. Unlike Marx's heavy writings, Kropotkin wrote in simple, hopeful language that ordinary workers could understand. His vision offered something Marx couldn't, a stateless path to communism without needing a workers' government first. Anarchists finally had a clear answer about what would replace capitalism. The long-term impact was huge. Kropotkin's anarcho-communism became the main form of anarchism for the next century. Even today, when people talk about mutual aid or gift economies, they're echoing Kropotkin's vision of decentralized communities free from government control. What do you think about a world without money or government? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Up next, we'll dive into how radical French revolutionaries took control of their government and tried remaking society through pure reason and terror. Jacobinism. When the French Revolution exploded in 1789, nobody expected a small political club to become Europe's most feared organization. The Jacobin Club started as the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, meeting in a former convent. Founded by anti-royalist deputies from Brittany, it grew into a nationwide movement with over 500,000 members. What began as a discussion group for reform-minded politicians quickly turned into something far more dangerous. Tension built throughout the early 1790s as France faced enemies inside and outside its borders. Foreign armies threatened to crush the revolution while counter-revolutionaries plotted from within. Jacobins watched moderate politicians fail to handle these crises and grew frustrated with half measures. By 1793, radicals like Maximilien Robespierre had taken control, arguing that only extreme action could save the revolution. The decisive moment came when terror was declared the order of the day on September 5, 1793. Robespierre joined the Committee of Public Safety, and this group of 12 men turned France into a Jacobin dictatorship. The reign of terror lasted until July 27, 1794, as the government took harsh measures against suspected enemies. The guillotine worked overtime. Thousands were executed, not just nobles and priests, but ordinary people accused of being counter-revolutionaries. The aftermath was chaos and fear. Even fellow Jacobins began fearing they'd be next on the execution list. Robespierre faced growing opposition due to the politically motivated violence. In 1794, he was overthrown and executed, ending the terror as dramatically as it had begun. The long-term impact was massive. Jacobinism became a word that terrified rulers across Europe for generations. The idea that ordinary people could organize into clubs and overthrow governments spread fear among the powerful. Yet, Jacobins also showed that regular citizens could control their own destiny, inspiring democratic movements worldwide. Their legacy lived on in every later revolution, proving their vision of popular sovereignty couldn't be killed with them. Up next, we'll explore how one ambitious general took the chaos left by failed revolutionaries and built it into a personal empire that would reshape Europe forever. Bonapartism. Picture France in the early 1800s, revolution-torn, desperate for stability, yet hungry for glory. From this chaos emerged Bonapartism, a political philosophy blending democratic populism with authoritarian rule, promising to give the people what they wanted while keeping power in one charismatic leader's hands. The stage was set for Bonapartism's return in 1848 when revolutionary fervor swept Europe. France's Second Republic collapsed between competing monarchists, republicans, and socialists. Into this vacuum stepped Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew. The Bonaparte name carried magical power among French peasants and workers who remembered Napoleon's glory days. But Louis Napoleon wasn't content being president. On December 2, 1851, he executed a masterful coup, dissolving the National Assembly and seizing absolute power. A year later, he proclaimed himself Emperor Napoleon III. This was Bonapartism in full bloom, combining plebiscitary democracy with authoritarian control, promising prosperity while dismantling democratic institutions. The immediate aftermath validated Bonapartist principles entirely. France experienced unprecedented economic growth, massive infrastructure projects, and 2 decades of prosperity under authoritarian rule. Napoleon III rebuilt Paris, expanded railways, and pursued aggressive foreign policy that restored French prestige. Yet, the contradictions that made Bonapartism successful ultimately destroyed it. The Franco-Prussian War in 1870 exposed the weakness of a system built on personal charisma rather than institutions. When Napoleon III was captured at Sedan, his regime collapsed overnight. The dynasty ended when his son died in 1879. Bonapartism's legacy extended far beyond the Second Empire's fall. It established a template for authoritarian populism that would resurface repeatedly. The idea that democracy and dictatorship could coexist, that popular will could be embodied in a single leader above traditional institutions. Let me know in the comments how Bonapartism compares to modern political movements. Next, we're tackling a political ideology that promises to break the chains of both capitalism and traditional socialism through permanent revolution. Tier 4. Pabloism. After World War II, the worldwide Trotskyist movement ran into problems they didn't expect. The Fourth International, their main organization, thought there would be big revolutions everywhere, but instead, capitalism stayed strong, and Stalin's Soviet Union took control of more countries in Eastern Europe. Two men, Michel Pablo from Greece and Ernest Mandel from Belgium, came up with new ideas that split the Trotskyist movement apart. This split became known as Pabloism. Traditional Trotskyists were getting frustrated because their predictions about revolution weren't coming true. Starting in early 1951, Pablo's group began pushing new ideas that many other Trotskyists thought were wrong. Pablo argued that Trotskyists should join Stalin's communist parties and work from inside them, instead of building their own separate revolutionary groups. This horrified traditional Trotskyists who saw Stalin's communism as the enemy of real revolution. The movement split into two camps: those who wanted to stick to traditional Trotskyist beliefs and those willing to compromise within the political reality of the Cold War. The big break happened in 1953 when American and British Trotskyist groups left Pablo's organization and formed their own group called the International Committee of the Fourth International. James P. Cannon, an American leader, wrote a famous open letter attacking Pablo for betraying true Trotskyist principles. This wasn't just about strategy. They had deep disagreements about Stalin's system, revolutionary parties, and whether real socialism could come from bureaucratic governments. The split was devastating for the already small Trotskyist movement. People who had worked together for decades suddenly became enemies. With Cannon's group fighting against Pablo's group, the organization that was supposed to lead the world revolution had become a war zone of competing ideas about Marxism. The damage lasted for decades. Even though they partly reunited in 1963, the Fourth International never got back its unity or influence from before 1953. The Pablo controversy permanently weakened their claims to be the real revolutionary movement, leaving them broken into competing groups that still exist today. Pablo eventually abandoned traditional Trotskyism, while his opponents continued to use Pabloite revolutionism as an example of what happens when revolutionaries compromise too much with existing power structures. Up next, an ideology that rejected all established values and believed in the power of complete negation. Russian nihilism. Russian nihilism began in the mid-1800s as a reaction against old traditions and the power of the church. Young thinkers grew tired of strict social rules and wanted to base their beliefs on reason and science, drawing inspiration from Nikolai Chernyshevsky's novel, What Is to Be Done, which showed a character devoted to changing society for the better. As students and writers gathered in St. Petersburg cafes and private reading groups, debates grew heated. Some argued for slow, peaceful reform, while others insisted that only a complete break with the past could bring real change. They read European works on evolution and materialism, questioned government power, and even challenged family roles. These arguments set the stage for a direct clash with the Tsarist rulers. The movement's most dramatic moment came in 1866 when a young nihilistic named Dmitry Karakozov tried to shoot Tsar Alexander II at the Summer Garden Gates. His pistol misfired, and he was caught right away, but the attempt shook the entire country and showed how far some were willing to go to force change. After the shooting, the government cracked down hard. They arrested many suspected radicals, tightened press censorship, and limited student activities. Police watched the families of known nihilists, and many activists went into hiding. Across Russia, people felt both drawn to the movement's bold ideals and frightened by its violence. Although violent nihilism lost popular support, its core ideas lived on. The emphasis on reason, science, and questioning all authority influenced later groups like the populists of the 1870s and the Marxists who led the 1917 revolutions. By daring to challenge old systems, nihilism changed Russia's political and intellectual landscape forever. If you found this video interesting so far, please give it a like and consider subscribing. Now, we'll dive into a fascinating philosophy that celebrates self-interest and moral autonomy. Egoism. In the late 1800s, people began to think of egoism as a way of looking at life that put each person's own needs first. It was first explained in two simple ways. One, that people naturally acted out of self-interest, and two, that they should act in their own best interest. Scholars pointed out that even acts of kindness had hidden benefits for the giver, psychological egoism, and that caring for yourself was the right thing to do, ethical egoism. This idea shook up the usual belief that selfishness was bad and sparked a lively argument about whether loving yourself was a moral problem. As egoism spread, some praised it as honest and realistic, while others feared it would turn people greedy and break community ties. Critics warned that putting yourself above everyone else could hurt friendships, but supporters said you could look out for yourself and still respect others. In the 1840s, Max Stirner argued that each person was the source of their own value, pushing back against strict rules and group thinking. Later, thinkers like James Rachels added that caring for your own long-term happiness didn't always mean hurting other people. In 1844, Stirner published The Ego and Its Own, showing that each person should be their own authority. A century later, in 1964, Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness praised careful self-interest as the key to progress. These works use clear examples to show how following your own goals could lead to new ideas, creativity, and a strong sense of responsibility. Readers connected with stories of people standing by their beliefs, making the idea of self-interest feel real and relatable. After those books came out, reactions poured in from writers, teachers, and activists. Some welcomed a clearer moral guide, while others feared it would lead to too much greed. Over time, egoism influenced libertarian politics and inspired versions of individualist anarchism, and it kept raising questions about how to balance self-care with caring for the community. Even today, these debates come up whenever we wonder what it really means to live for ourselves. For our next entry, we will talk about a movement that blends radical decentralization with a sense of strong collective identity and heritage. Tier 5. National Anarchism. In the late 1990s, a small group of activists in Britain began to mix ideas of ethnic nationalism with anarchist calls for a stateless society. They called themselves national anarchists and argued that people of the same heritage should be free to form autonomous, homogeneous communities without interference from a central government. Led by Troy Southgate, who had already founded the National Revolutionary faction, these thinkers claimed to be beyond left and right, borrowing from classic anarchists like Bakunin and Stirner while embracing racial separatism and traditionalist culture. The stage was set for a curious blend of ultranationalism and anti-statism that challenged both mainstream politics and established anarchist philosophy. As the idea spread, tensions flared between national anarchists and both the far right and the anarchist left. Some far-right circles worried that stateless tribal communes would weaken collective racial power, while many anarchists denounced the project as fascism in disguise. Rival publications like Alternative Green and events such as the Anarchist Heretics Fair became battlegrounds where national anarchists clashed with anti-fascist organizers. Pivotal moments like the publication of Southgate's manifestos and the involvement of figures such as Jonathan Boulter sparked heated debates about whether you could truly merge an egalitarian impulse with ethnic exclusivity. By the early 2000s, national anarchists had held a series of public meetings and small rallies, often framed as cultural festivals celebrating folk traditions and local self-rule. In vivid gatherings across the UK, Australia, and the United States, attendees dressed in traditional garb shared speeches on tribal sovereignty and discussed plans for ecologically sustainable communes. Observers described these events as part political lecture, part revivalist fair, at once defiant and strangely anachronistic. For the national anarchists, these gatherings were proof that their vision could unite heritage, ecology, and self-government in a living example. Almost immediately after those early meetings, journalists and scholars exposed national anarchism as a thinly veiled form of far-right extremism. Anarchist groups condemned it as an oxymoron and a Trojan horse for racism, while anti-hate organizations placed its small networks under scrutiny. In the years that followed, national anarchism remained a fringe movement, its ideals carried forward by isolated cells and occasional manifestos, but never gaining mass appeal. Yet, its legacy forced a fresh look at how radical ideologies can morph and merge, reminding everyone that the lines between left and right can blur in unexpected ways. If you found this exploration of national anarchism eye-opening, stay tuned as up next, we're delving into an ideology that wove community solidarity with land stewardship in surprising ways. Geomutualism. Around the early 2000s, a small group of thinkers introduced something they called geomutualism. It was a mix of two ideas, one from mutualist economics, which focused on fair trade and cooperation, and another one from panarchism, which supported the idea that people should choose their own systems of governance without needing borders or a central state. They believed that the value of the earth, especially land, should be shared by everyone, while each person's work should still belong to them. They also supported interest-free loans using land owned by the community so everyone could get access to land and money in a fair way. This sparked a new conversation on how to handle land, ownership, and community decision-making. As these ideas spread through online groups and freedom-focused events, supporters of geomutualism found themselves clashing with older movements. Some people who followed Henry George liked the idea of sharing land value but didn't agree with the focus on shared lending. Meanwhile, old-school mutualists liked the lending part but worried that leasing land might still allow a few people to control too much. Important moments, like a 2018 meeting in Berlin and a widely shared article about henocentric law, heated up debates and raised tough questions about whether land should be owned together or just managed fairly by local communities. Soon after, a few small projects started up. In Europe and Latin America, people tested these ideas through shared housing and farmland setups. One clear example came from Spain, where a group living in an old squat turned it into a geomutualist community. They put money into a shared bank, got equal access to farmland, and tracked work through a simple online system. Visitors saw farmers and programmers working side by side, trading fruits and computer code with the same energy. It felt like a mix of a tech co-op and a modern-day village, turning a big idea into something real and visible. Once these projects gained attention, researchers and political thinkers started talking. Some praised geomutualism for connecting shared land value and fair lending. Others pointed out possible problems, like confusing rules or legal issues. Though the movement stayed small, its ideas spread quietly through other cooperative and land reform circles. Today, it still inspires new ways of thinking about land and money. In this next part, we'll explore a strange mix of outer space dreams and revolutionary politics. Posadism. In the early and mid-20th century, a unique political current emerged around the personality of J. Posadas, an Argentine Trotskyist born Homero Cristalli. He led a faction called the Fourth International Posadist, breaking away in 1962 after disagreements over nuclear war, which he believed could destroy capitalism and make way for socialism. Posadas fused classic Marxism with an unusual belief that visiting alien civilizations must be communist. This clash of conventional left-wing politics with UFO fascination set the stage for a movement that was both serious and surreal. As his ideas spread, tensions flared. Posadas argued nuclear war could accelerate revolution, drawing sharp criticism from other Trotskyists who feared its catastrophic consequences. By the late 1960s, Posadas began incorporating UFOs into his thinking. He claimed that extraterrestrials coming to Earth must come from a highly advanced socialist society, and he called for humans to appeal to them for help in ending poverty and war. Rival groups mocked these theories as utopian absurdity, while Posadists championed them as bold and forward-thinking. The core moment came in 1968 when Posadas published his UFO pamphlet, Flying Saucers: The Process of Matter and Energy, Science, the Revolutionary and Working Class Struggle and the Socialist Future of Mankind. In it, he portrayed aliens as peaceful observers who could offer Earth a path out of capitalist chaos. This pamphlet painted vivid images of flying saucers hovering above battlefields and spaceships supplying revolutionary messages. For followers, it felt like a call to imagine beyond earthly politics, an epic mix of science fiction and class struggle, rife with possibility and idealism. Immediately after, mainstream leftists recoiled. Posadists were labeled cultish, with critics ridiculing their nuclear war stance and UFO obsession. Journalists and political opponents dismissed them as more meme than movement. Posadas himself became an increasingly isolated figure, expelling dissenters and shrinking the group's size. By the mid-1970s, his influence had waned, and after his death in 1981, only a few small cells remained. In the long run, Posadism shaped political lore more than politics. Its legacy endured online through memes, ironic tributes, and neo-Posadist groups that revived interest in its cosmic combination of socialism, apocalypse, and UFOs. Though its real-world impact was fleeting, Posadism left a lasting mark as a symbol of the wildest possibilities within revolutionary thought. If you enjoyed this wild ride through radical history, remember to comment and like the video. For our next topic, we'll talk about a movement that challenged social norms with clinical detachment and bold skeptical eyes. Tier 6. Bazaarivism. Ivan Turgenev introduced Yevgeny Bazarov in Fathers and Sons as a doctor who trusted only science and rejected everything else. He called himself a nihilist, laughed at art, traditions, and authority, and insisted that only what could be tested and proven, science and reason, mattered. His ideas struck a chord with the critic Dmitry Pisarev, who in 1862 praised Bazarov as a hero for a generation freed from serfdom and ready to challenge old beliefs. Soon after the novel appeared, students in Moscow and St. Petersburg were hotly debating the value of denying old ideas and pushing for progress. Pisarev's essays fanned these debates, urging young thinkers to reject inherited customs and fight for big social changes. Tensions rose as students protested for better education under Tsar Alexander II, while conservatives worried about the growing boldness of these nihilists. By spring 1862, arson in the cities and rumors of uprising in Poland showed that these literary debates were spilling into real life. At the center of this storm was Bazarovism itself, the outright refusal of art, religion, and family loyalty. In drawing rooms and lecture halls, admirers quoted Bazarov's line, "Everything is subject to denial," with excitement and defiance. Students even acted out his arguments with the older aristocrats, bringing Turgenev's fictional clashes into reality. It felt as if the novel had jumped off the page and split generations apart, forcing everyone to pick a side. When the dust settled, reactions were intense. Critics like Nikolai Chernyshevsky accused Turgenev of mocking true reformers, and others pointed out Bazarov's harshness, even toward his own parents, as a flaw in nihilism. But the long-term effects were more significant. Bazarovism planted the seeds for radicals who would later reshape Russia, and nihilist became the label for anyone demanding a full overhaul of society. If this glimpse into Bazarov's world sparked your interest, get ready, because up next is an even stranger idea where the universe itself seems to mock our ambitions. It's only about to get darker and stranger from here. Cosmicism. In the early 1900s, H.P. Lovecraft introduced a chilling worldview called cosmicism. Living in a time when science was revealing the vastness of the universe, Lovecraft saw these discoveries not as awe-inspiring, but terrifying. To him, they proved how small and powerless humans truly are. He rejected religion and any idea of deeper meaning. In his eyes, we live in a cold, indifferent universe that doesn't notice or care about us. His writings gave rise to a new kind of horror, one that didn't rely on ghosts or killers, but on the terror of realizing our own insignificance. As science advanced, people began to grasp new strange ideas: non-Euclidean geometry, cosmic distances, alien possibilities. Lovecraft turned these into stories where characters who searched too deeply for the truth often paid the price. In his tales, the real horror wasn't a monster, it was the knowledge itself. Knowing too much can unravel the mind. The universe, once thought to be understandable, became a place of unspeakable truths. In stories like The Call of Cthulhu and The Color Out of Space, Lovecraft's characters discovered ancient godlike beings, the Great Old Ones, who existed beyond human understanding. These entities weren't evil, they were simply indifferent. Human life meant nothing to them. The characters who encountered them often went insane or died, not because of what the beings did, but because their presence shattered everything the characters thought they knew. Lovecraft's message was unsettling. The pursuit of knowledge might destroy us, and the universe might be too vast, too strange, and too uncaring for human minds to ever grasp. His work reshaped horror, moving it away from personal fears and towards something deeper, the dread of cosmic meaningless. Today, cosmicism still echoes in literature, film, and art, influencing creators who explore the idea that humans are not central to existence. Lovecraft left us with a haunting idea. The most terrifying thing isn't what lurks in the shadows, it's the realization that we are alone in an uncaring universe. Have you seen any media with Lovecraftian horror? Let me know in the comments. Next, we'll explore a strange belief that dares to dream beyond logic, where imagination meets the impossible. Impossibilism. In the early 1900s, socialist thinkers found themselves at a crossroads. Some argued that passing liberal welfare laws or electing social democratic parties would smoothly lead to a fairer system, while others warned these small fixes only propped up capitalism. Out of this friction, impossibilism was born. It insisted that chasing reforms under capitalism was not just futile, it actually strengthened the very system socialists wanted to replace. Pioneers such as the Socialist Party of Great Britain, founded in 1904, and later the World Socialist Movement, rejected anything short of wholesale structural change. They claimed that half measures dulled working-class resolve and buried the goal of true socialism under layers of compromise. Tensions flared at party conferences and in the pages of early Marxist journals. Reform-minded socialists pointed to incremental gains, like better labor laws, as proof that capitalism could be tamed. Impossibilists fired back, arguing these victories merely patched up the system's worst abuses and convinced workers that capitalism could be humanized. In Britain and beyond, pamphlet wars erupted, with each side accusing the other of betrayal. By the 1910s, impossibilism had crystallized into a clear doctrine, focused solely on educating workers about the need for a complete system overhaul and reject any alliances with the reformist currents. At its core, impossibilism told a vivid story. Capitalism could not be improved from within. Activists dismantled the idea that universal suffrage or social insurance would naturally usher in socialism. Instead, they organized around the belief that only conscious, collective action aimed at seizing the means of production would shatter the capitalist order. Meetings brimmed with fiery speeches decrying petty reforms, while leaflets laid out a roadmap for revolutionary change. These efforts gave rise to tightly knit groups whose purpose was not to win seats in parliament, but to prepare the working class for a decisive break. Almost immediately, impossibilist groups faced isolation. Without a willingness to cooperate on moderate measures, they remained small and often misunderstood. Yet, their ideas echoed through later socialist debates, influencing currents from De Leonism in the United States to anti-revisionist factions worldwide. Over decades, the impossibilist emphasis on structural transformation continued to challenge reform-focused strategies, reminding activists that compromise could sometimes betray the cause they sought to advance. Up next is a weird doctrine where reciprocal bonds take on a strangely unsettling twist. Tier 7. Dark Mutualism. In the beginning, nature was anything but simple. Dark mutualism had been hiding in the shadows of ecological research, and scientists were just beginning to uncover its mysteries. It wasn't like the usual helpful partnerships in nature, such as bees pollinating flowers. Instead, it involved more confusing relationships, one that were both helpful and harmful at the same time. One example was found in plants. Some tiny fungi called dark septate endophytes, DSE, lived inside plant roots. At first, they didn't seem helpful or harmful, but researchers found that these fungi gave off extra nutrients as part of their own survival, which sometimes helped plants grow better during stressful conditions. It was a weird kind of teamwork, accidental but real. At first, scientists didn't know what to make of it. Some thought that these fungi were weak parasites, others said they didn't really do much at all. The problem was that the effects changed depending on the type of plant or the environment. So the big question was, are these fungi friends or enemies? A key idea came when researchers suggested that these fungi weren't trying to help the plants, but their waste still helped anyway. This changed how people saw them. The fungi weren't fully helpful like classic partners, but they also weren't just parasites either. They were somewhere in between. When experiments were done, the results were surprising. Plants grown with these fungi in poor soil often did better than those without. They absorbed more minerals and handled dry conditions better, even though the fungi didn't plan to help. It was like getting help from a stranger who just happened to be around. Photos from the lab showed roots wrapped in dark fungal threads, making the strange relationship look even more mysterious. After these findings came out, ecologists had mixed reactions. Some thought it didn't mean much, others believed it could change how we understand cooperation in nature. Scientists rushed to test the idea in different places, hoping to prove it wasn't just a one-time thing. It showed that not everything fits neatly into good or bad. Some partnerships are messy and complex, but still important. It may even lead to better farming methods in the future. Up next, we'll explore a deep and gritty idea that questions the very building blocks of reality. Base materialism. Back in the early 1900s, some philosophers started to question what matter really was. One of them, Georges Bataille, came up with a strange and powerful idea called base materialism. Around the 1920s and 1930s, he argued that matter wasn't just a passive thing we build on, like bricks or atoms. Instead, he saw it as wild, messy, and full of chaos. It didn't follow rules, and it didn't care about categories like high or low. Inspired by old religious ideas from Gnosticism, Bataille believed this kind of base matter could break apart all the neat labels philosophers liked to use. Before this, materialists thought everything in the world could be explained through matter, tiny particles, energy, and laws of nature. But Bataille pointed out that even this view treated matter like something quiet and boring, something that just sits there. He didn't agree. He believed matter had the power to disrupt, to surprise, and to confuse. This made people in the philosophy world uneasy. Was matter really just physical stuff, or was it something wilder? Some thinkers welcomed this shakeup, others weren't so sure. Bataille's idea introduced a new way to see things, not as black and white, but as messy and unpredictable. When Bataille explained his theory, it wasn't dry or technical, it was intense and dramatic. He said base matter wasn't logical or polite, it didn't fit into neat arguments. It was chaotic, strange, and didn't care about human values. People online later summed it as a flow that destroys all metaphysics. In other words, it didn't just sit under philosophy, it tore its foundation apart. It wasn't a quiet idea, it was loud and disruptive. Right after these ideas spread, reactions came fast. Some philosophers, like Derrida and Agamben, were intrigued and started using parts of it in their own work. Others thought it too confusing or just meant to stir up trouble. Still, it shook things up. Over time, base materialism influenced how people thought about meaning, truth, and the physical world. It showed that matter could be something active, not just something we study. What do you think of this strange take on matter? Let me know in the comments below. If you're still here, we'll dive into a bold new philosophy that challenges how opposites collide, flip, and rebuild meaning from the ground up. Dialectic. German thinker Julius Bonson lived in the 1800s and found himself caught between two big names, Hegel and Schopenhauer. He studied under Gregor Wilhelm Nietzsche at Tübingen and spent years wrestling with Hegel's idea that history moves by a three-step process: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But he never felt it rang true. At the same time, Schopenhauer's view that an irrational will drives everything spoke to Bonson's growing belief that reality was made up of many conflicting parts. By 1867, when he published his two-volume Contributions to Characterology, Bonson was already hinting at a brand new way to think about these clashes. His students noticed that he kept asking tough questions, refusing to smooth over conflicts or force them into neat resolutions. As his thoughts took shape, Bonson sparred with other philosophers like Nikolai Hartmann. Hartmann argued that many individual wills would eventually flow together into one guiding spirit. Bonson shot back that this idea ignored the true nature of conflict. In his eyes, each will was separate and driven by its own hidden impulses. Their debate reached a peak in 1880 when Bonson released The Contradiction in the Knowledge and Being of the World. Critics called his work gloomy, but Bonson welcomed that label. He believed endless contradiction was simply how the world worked. In those later writings, Bonson finally gave his theory a name, Dialectic. Unlike Hegel's model, which aimed for a higher unity, Dialectic said opposing forces didn't merge but instead destroyed one another. There was no grand plan or guiding hand behind these clashes. They ended in one side triumphing and the other being wiped out. Drawing on his studies of character, Bonson described life as a series of tragic showdowns that left the world in pieces rather than forging new wholeness. Right after Dialectic appeared, it shook up schools of thought that focused on pessimism and changed how people talked about tragedy. Bonson's students began using his ideas to analyze literature and psychology, seeing characters trapped by impossible choices. Over time, his work influenced later existentialist thinkers who viewed human life as a battlefield of inner struggles. Though he never became as famous as Hegel or Schopenhauer, Bonson's dialectic approach laid the groundwork for modern ideas about pluralism and enduring conflict. We're approaching the end of the iceberg. If you're still around, thank you for watching. Now, let's get into the deepest part of these ideologies. Tier 8. The Vicious Circle. A vicious circle is a cycle that keeps getting worse because each step makes the next one harder to escape. Think of it like a feedback loop. Every time the loop turns, it digs everyone involved into a deeper hole. Early in the 20th century, thinkers warned about a vicious circle principle to stop us from using definitions that depend on themselves, like talking about a list that contains itself, which leads to paradoxes in logic. In real life, this idea shows up whenever negative forces feed on each other, whether in economies, societies, or ecosystems. and keep driving things downhill until something from the outside breaks the pattern. By the late 2000s, that pattern was clear in housing and banking. When home values fell, many homeowners owed more on their mortgages than their houses were worth, so defaults and foreclosures rose. Banks lost huge sums on those bad loans and stopped lending money. Without new loans, businesses couldn't grow, jobs were lost, and people had less money to spend. Those problems piled up, making the next round of home price drops and job losses even worse. Regulators and bankers argued over how to fix things, but each failed plan seemed to only deepen the fear that no fix would work. The subprime mortgage crisis became the poster child for a vicious circle. Families lost the equity they once had in their homes. Foreclosure signs went up on streets all across the country. Unemployment climbed. Home prices dropped again. The result was entire neighborhoods emptied out, with auction notices where families once lived. It looked like a storm that kept fueling itself, growing stronger and more destructive as it went. In the crisis's aftermath, governments stepped in to shore up banks and offered to help struggling homeowners, hoping to inject money and confidence back into the system. Emotionally, people felt betrayed and powerless. Financially, banks faced holes in their balance sheets that took years to fill. Long-term changes followed: stricter mortgage rules, tighter oversight of complex financial products, and better coordination between countries on monetary policy. The key lesson was clear: without an outside force to interrupt them, vicious circles can tear even strong systems apart. Our next topic explores another provocative framework that flipped conventional wisdom on its head. Acephalo. In 1936, Paris, Georges Bataille and a group of artists and thinkers formed Acephalo, a secret society and magazine born from disillusionment with surrealism and fear of rising fascism. Influenced by Nietzsche's idea that God is dead and the need to rethink values, they rejected traditional leadership, reflected in the group's name, meaning headless. Members like Roger Caillois and André Mazin held mysterious rituals under a lightning-scarred tree, honored the beheading of Louis XVI, and refused to associate with anti-Semites. As tensions in Europe grew, Bataille and his circle believed that both the political left and right were failing. Fascists had started twisting Nietzsche's idea for their own purposes, especially with help from Nietzsche's own sister. Acephalo wanted to reclaim the true, wild spirit of Nietzsche's work. In the woods, the group held intense rituals, meditating on the writings of Nietzsche, Freud, and the controversial Marquis de Sade. They even discussed the idea of a symbolic human sacrifice and debated whether to kill a goat or even a gibbon as a test of their commitment. Members had to stay anonymous, show total loyalty, and be ready to either change deeply or stop existing as they were. The most intense part of the story happened during these forest ceremonies. Sometimes they were naked, walking in circles around the oak tree, chanting, meditating, and performing strange acts. At one point, they planned to burn a gibbon's body, but stopped short. The rituals were full of masks, fire, and strange symbols, rejecting logic and celebrating raw emotion and chaos. Even though no one was killed, the very idea shocked the boundaries of modern thinking. Soon after, the group faded away, partly because of World War II, and partly because the whole thing had pushed them to their emotional limits. Some members looked back and saw it as a mistake, while others felt it had touched something sacred and powerful. Not much was written down, but fragments survived in their publication in a piece called The Sacred Conspiracy. Despite its short life, Acephalo had a lasting impact. It influenced later thinkers like Michel Foucault and helped shape ideas in sociology and post-war philosophy. Its story still raises a haunting question: could humans really live without leaders or logical systems? Let me know in the comments below. Finally, we'll explore one last ideology, born from myth and flame, that blended devotion, transformation, and ancient power into a force that reshaped both spirit and society. The Draconian Faith. The Draconian Faith began as a mystical belief system centered around dragons and the natural flow of life. It came from a fantasy world called Luminaria, where people believed the stages of a dragon's life, from egg to spirit flame, reflected the different stages of a human's life. Followers, known as Draconi, felt spiritually connected to the four guardian dragons: Onurj, Asurj, Prajarj, and Brajakarj. Each dragon represented a natural element, and together they served messengers for the highest god, Arjkan. Worshippers often traveled to wild, sacred places like mountain peaks and ancient ruins to perform rituals that honored life and nature. As time passed, tensions grew between the Draconi and followers of other beliefs. Some leaders worried about how popular the Draconian faith was becoming. Arguments broke out over who controlled certain shrines, and people from more rigid belief systems saw the dragon rituals as wild and dangerous. Whispers spread of a powerful ceremony that could awaken sleeping dragon energy and shift the balance between nature and spirit, something many feared could change reality itself. Excitement and anxiety built with each celebration, leading up to a moment everyone was waiting for. That moment was the Great Rite. On that day, under a dark red sky, believers gathered around a sacred altar. They chanted in the old dragon language while flames danced and lit up the night. Priests held up the dragon egg talisman and called upon the 4 guardian dragons to bring Arshkan's power. The fire roared, and some worshippers felt themselves transformed, as if they were no longer just human, but part dragon. Many had intense visions of cosmic creatures and ancient powers. For a brief moment, the world felt like it was full of raw, untamed magic. Afterward, people were deeply changed. Some felt calm and full of wisdom. Others were shaken by what they'd seen. The roads filled with emotional gatherings, healings, and stories of divine experiences. Outside groups were both scared and curious. Officials sent people to investigate, and scholars began collecting stories. For those who believed, this was just the beginning of something larger. In the years that followed, the faith left a deep mark. It shaped new ways of thinking about nature, personal growth, and even politics. Its teachings about balance and transformation inspired many. Even though the belief system changed over time, its message of becoming your truest self, like a dragon rising through fire, stayed strong. We've now reached the end of this iceberg. Let me know in the comments which ideology you were most interested in, and make sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. Also, don't forget to check out our last iceberg video here.